Hey everybody, it's Dan. Yes, I'm just filming a few videos here back to back. So, same shirt, same hat, I don't care. Now, this one is by far one of my absolute favorite films of all time. This is the 1986 remake of The Fly, directed by David Cronenberg and starring Gina Davis, John Getz, and of course, Jeff Goldblum. Jeff Goldblum, to a lot of people, will always be Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, but for me, Jeff Goldblum will always be Brundlefly. Oh, this is such a good movie. Um, Now, I did have kind of, a thought while I was watching this, though. Back when I was younger and really into, horror movies and things like that, basically it was really just kind of like the gorier the better. Oh, it was fantastic. I loved the mass murderer films like Halloween and things like that, where there was some kind of killer going around and slicing people up and just all sorts of things, and just gore and blood and guts everywhere. And now that I've kind of grown up and matured and everything, my taste in horror has changed, and I'm really more into like the ghost stories and like psychological horror and things like that, that just kind of like really leave you thinking. I mean, of course, I'll still watch them all, and I still love all of the old films that I used to watch when I was a kid. But I just, I guess things change, and that's that. So let me know what you guys think about that in the comments, actually, and tell me how your tastes have changed in films and whatnot over the years. But anyway, getting back to 1986's The Fly, the remake by David Cronenberg. Now, David Cronenberg was a huge fan of like body horror and sexual horror and things like that, which the latter really showed with his film Shivers, which is also known as, was it the Parasite Murders. Um, but this one, in my opinion, is some of his finest work. So it starts off with Seth Brundle. He's a scientist, he's a physicist, he has a huge just unease with travel. He gets travel sick very easily. So he's always been fascinated with trying to figure out a way to stop that. And what better way than to just teleport from place to place, right? So he has spent the majority of his, career trying to develop teleportation devices. And he's got two of what he calls telepods. They're large, they can fit a large animal, they can fit a human, all of that stuff. But he hasn't really perfected them, he hasn't tested them very well or anything. And he meets Gina Davis at this party and decides to have her come out and investigate this, maybe write a piece about it because she's a reporter. Well, she does, and she thinks it's fascinating, but really it's just kind of, it hasn't been proven yet, so what can you do? But then he takes one of her stockings, he puts it in one telepod, seals them up, and then does his, computer magic, and sure enough, it vanishes out of the one telepod, is atomized, moves over to the other telepod, comes back. So she's pretty amazed by this. There's then another scene a bit later where he decides to test it on a baboon, but of course the baboon turns itself inside out. It's just gory as all get out. And it I mean, David Cronenberg was not ashamed of showing this kind of thing. So, it doesn't work on living tissue. Living organisms can't go through. But eventually, Seth Brundle perfects it so that it does work. And he decides that he's just going to, try it himself. And he goes through, and of course, we, the audience, see that there's a fly inside it on one of the windows. There's little, viewports. But he doesn't see it. So he goes through, and of course, it merges his DNA with the fly's DNA. Now, he comes out looking perfectly human, but in a very different take on the original, where Andre was, slowly losing his mind and becoming, like a fly, like an acting like a fly. Um, Seth Brundle looks human, but then slowly begins to physically metamorphose into like a fly human hybrid. And it is one of the most visceral and disgusting changes in any film, even up to this day. It has some of the best practical effects that I have ever seen in a film. Um, I can only really think of one film to top it that we'll be getting on in a few days here. But oh, it's so beautiful in its terror. Um, and of course, he's freaking out. He's scared. He's slowly turning into a fly. The first thing he notices is that he's much more agile. He exhibits greater strength, things like that. He goes out and, arm wrestles a guy at a bar and just breaks his arm apart. The bone comes out. It's really hideous looking. And then slowly but surely, other things start to happen. Like he starts losing his fingernails. I mean, there's a point where he literally rips one right out. His teeth start to come out. One of his ears you just see drop off at one point. And, he had no need for his genitals. I'll leave it at that. Um, yeah, and you see him just like start to metamorphose into just this hideous fly creature. He starts to crawl on walls. He eats his food by vomiting acid onto it and then sucking up the acid. I mean, oh, it is so incredible. There's a point where one of the other characters, he actually vomits on the guy's hand as he's like, holding him back, and the hand just melts off. So sick. Um, and ultimately, as he starts to become more and more like a fly, and he finds out that Gina Davis's character is pregnant, he decides, well, since this thing basically just like, cuts up DNA and molds it all together into one being, let's become the perfect family. Let's be mother, father, and child all wrapped into one person and fly. But I'm relatively certain because there was a sequel to this, The Fly 2, and one of the things that they did in that was, talk about how having more humans in there with the person who had, the fly DNA in them could basically just sort of like negate that fly DNA. So I don't know if that's possible or not. In the second film, it certainly was in the end, but in this one, it probably would have negated most of the fly stuff and just had him be, a human again, but it would have been a human combination of all three of them with just a tiny amount of fly DNA in it. So I wonder if it still would have retained its, strength and stamina and endurance and things like that. But so anyway, there's a point where Gina Davis just kind of like punches him in the head, like trying to get him away. And, she punches him, she puts her hand up on his face and just like, pushes his face away, basically. His face breaks open and it's just this hideous fly head underneath of it. The jaw comes off and just, it was amazing. And, he's trying to get her into the pod with him. And the other guy, starts shooting him with a shotgun. She ends up getting away, and he's like half in and half out of the pod, like trying to come back out when the guy shoots the cables, and something happens that activates it, and him and the door to the pod end up disappearing and reappearing in the other pod. The other pod opens up, and smoke starts to billow out, and then he just like slumps out of it. He's, half Brundlefly, half pod at this point. The pod is sticking up out of his back, and it's just it's horrific. And he just kind of like crawls over to Gina Davis slowly, and he's down there on the ground, and she's looking up over him with the shotgun, and she like aims it at him, and then she just starts to cry, and she can't do it. And he just grabs it with his fly claw and just sticks the shotgun like right up to his head, and just kind of looks at her pleadingly, and finally she blows him away. And then it cuts to 9 months later, and she's having the child. But of course, her huge fear right now is that she was impregnated by Seth Brundle after he had gone through the pod with the fly. So what's going to happen to that child? And of course, she gives birth to a giant maggot. And yeah, credits roll. It's a very impressive movie. I love it. I can't get enough of it. And let's see here. So that's it for this one. But tomorrow we'll be going over another one of my favorite older films, and the following day, of course, its remake. But that one is actually very, very loosely based on a true story. But we'll get to that tomorrow. So to close this video up, when comparing the original 1958 The Fly and the 1986 The Fly, I'm going to have to go with the new one. The new one is absolutely fantastic. If you've not seen it, you should definitely check it out. If you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of gore, just anything, watch David Cronenberg's The Fly from 1986. All right, that's all I got. I'll see you tomorrow.